year, and the first 3 volumes of Order and History, Volume 1, Israel and Revelation, Volume 2, The World of the Polis, and Volume 3, Plato and Aristotle, LSU, 1956 and 1957. He and Lissy became American citizens in 1944 and retained their citizenship thereafter. Voegelin accepted an appointment in 1958, however, as Professor of Political Science at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, establishing the new Institute for Political Science there. During this period, the principal publication was Anamnesis, Piper, 1966, which directly presented the philosophy of consciousness underlying the work in English. After a decade, the Voegelins returned permanently to the United States in 1969. For a 5-year period ending in 1974, Voegelin held an appointment at Stanford University as Henry Salvatori Distinguished Scholar in the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. It was during this time that the present Autobiographical Reflections were produced. At the end of the period, the 4th volume of Order and History finally was published after a 17-year hiatus, entitled The Ecumenic Age, LSU, 1974. The Voegelins continued to live in Stanford after retirement, where Eric is buried and where his wife survives him. They have no children. In addition to the books mentioned, some 100 articles and essays were published during Professor Voegelin's lifetime, and voluminous materials were left unpublished in manuscript, including much of a 4,000-page study entitled The History of Political Ideas. Parts of this work were absorbed into Order and History, and 11 chapters were drawn together, edited by John H. Hallowell, and published under the title From Enlightenment to Revolution, Duke, 1975. Some 8 volumes, comprising the history of political ideas, are planned for publication in the collected works. The 5th volume of Order and History was published posthumously under the title of In Search of Order, LSU, 1987, as the capstone of Voegelin's revolutionary philosophy of politics, history, and consciousness. That, and in what sense Voegelin's work may be understood to be revolutionary, is argued in The Voegelinian Revolution, a biographical introduction, LSU, 1981. And the raison d'etre of the Autobiographical Reflections lies in work done in preparing that study. For Voegelin in 1973 was far from concerned with writing an autobiography or a memoir beyond what he already had done with the anamnestic experiments conducted in 1943 but only published in 1966 in Anamnesis. These fascinating sketches of recollections covered experiences from his boyhood that he found formative for his consciousness as a human being, beginning at 14 months with his very first recollection and coming down to about age 10. In 1972 and 1973 he was hard at work completing The Ecumenic Age, which came out a year later. My own work required greater detail about his biography than was readily available, so I began conducting tape-recorded interviews on subjects of importance to my study of his thought. These ranged over many subjects, and matters finally came to a head during the summer of 1973 while I was visiting Stanford for the purpose of gathering information, and began trying to put together a chronological and thematic account of Voegelin's intellectual development. After several false starts, we hit on the procedure of holding a series of interviews conducted on the basis of my inquiries, which would be responded to in an oral narrative dictated by Voegelin. To be sure the transcription could be made accurately, his secretary was present to take down everything in shorthand. All of this was done in the few days between June the 26th and July the 7th. We celebrated July the 4th, of course, in Voegelin's study at his residence on Sonoma Terrace, amidst clouds of cigar smoke from the 18 or so King Edward cigars he consumed each day, the fierce and frequent barking of the 2 pet Pekingese dogs that, despite Mrs. Voegelin's best efforts to keep them quiet, repulsed dangers on every side, the hum and clatter of the lawn-mower, roar of the vacuum cleaner, and frequent jangle of the telephone. These atmospherics have been purged from the text, but since I have just listened to the 27 hours of recordings again in preparing the manuscript for publication, they are vivid in my memory as I write, and were most definitely part of the experience 15 years ago. The transcription then was read and corrected by Voegelin and retyped in due course to form the revised document that I subsequently named the Autobiographical Memoir of Eric Voegelin, and quoted in extenso in my book. It's now retitled for independent publication. What Eric Voegelin's autobiography might have looked like had he sat down purposely to write one on his own volition, we can't know. My inquiries elicited the responses we've here. The questions asked and answered were ones, apart from basic information of a factual kind, that seemed most pressing for a full and precise understanding of material I had studied by and with Voegelin since my undergraduate days in his theory survey at LSU in 1950. Whatever the complexities of the subject matter, Voegelin's great gift as a teacher was his capacity to expound it simply, lucidly, and tellingly in living speech. This talent I luckily turned to advantage in my interviews with him that became in effect a private seminar running for 2 or 3 hours each morning for nearly a fortnight. What began as a rather pro forma exercise that I sensed was conceived partly as a means of putting an end to persistent questioning and of getting rid of a questioner who was bidding to become a troublesome distraction from the work, took on unexpected life. Voegelin warmed to the subject. He then proceeded to conduct, under prodding, and somewhat unwillingly at first, then in resignation, and finally with a relish reserved for the work itself, what gradually turned into a further anamnestic search for the reality of Eric Voegelin, whose story rises in its best moments into the meditative discourse of high philosophy. Even cold on the page, the result is a triumph in which all can rejoice. A word about mechanics. After section 11, the incisions and headings are mine. Since the obvious provenance of this manuscript was that of a background working paper for a study written by someone else, Voegelin didn't take the meticulous care in making emendations that he would have taken with a manuscript of his own that he would see through to final publication. With great caution, I have tried to fill this gap. Autobiographical Reflections. 1. University of Vienna. I attended the University of Vienna in the Faculty of Law from 1919 to the completion of my doctorate in 1922. The atmosphere of the university at the time was determined by the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War. By its composition, the university was still the university of the capital of the empire and reflected in its scholarship and the personal attitude of the professors this metropolitan atmosphere. At the time when I was a student, and throughout the 1920s, or rather until the effects of National Socialism made themselves felt in the early 30s, Vienna still had an enormous intellectual horizon, and was leading in science internationally in a number of fields. First, there was Hans Kelsen's theory of pure law, represented by Kelsen himself, and the growing number of younger men whom he'd educated, especially Alfred von Wedros and Adolf Merkel. Second, there was the Austrian school of marginal utility. Eugen Bohm-Borberg had already died, but Leopold von Wieser was still the grand old man who gave the principal course in economic theory. Among the younger economists, there was Ludwig von Mises, famous because of his development of money theory. Joseph A. Schumpeter was in grass at the time, but his work, of course, was studied. Among the further intellectual and spiritual components that would impress themselves on a young man at the time was the school of theoretical physics, going back to Ernst Mach, and represented at the time by Moritz Schlick. An important intellectual force in this circle was Ludwig Wittgenstein, less by his presence than by his work. There further must be mentioned the Austrian Institute for Geschichtsforschung, represented by Alphonse Dobbs, who by that time had attained international fame through his work on the history of Carolingian economics. Among the younger men there was the rising force of Otto Brunner, who later became famous by his theories of medieval feudalism, especially as published in Land und Herrschaft, 4th edition, 1959. A further glory of the University of Vienna at the time was the history of art.